I'm Larry Carver, and we're going to look today at the Gospel according to Matthew. Now this book is called the Gospel or Good News according to Matthew. A lot of people just like to call it Matthew's Gospel, which it would be in short, but it really is the Good News according to Matthew. Now Matthew probably didn't write this himself. This was written somewhere, they believe, between 70 and 110 in the Christian era. But it's probably more than likely written between 80 and 90. Now it was written for Greeks who were Jews. They were Greek-speaking Jews living probably in Syria. It was a community of Greeks that were outside of Israel. It was a Jewish Christian who wrote it, and from the Gospel you can tell that Matthew really understood Jewish law, or the author of this book really understood Jewish law. He was a good writer, it's well written, and it shows he was the author was an educated person, and understood the Hebrew style and customs of the time. Now, because it was the first gospel in the New Testament, for a long time people thought, obviously, this must be the first gospel that was put down on paper. But biblical scholarship has found that Matthew was not the first gospel that was written. The first gospel written was the Gospel of Mark. And Matthew, when he wrote his gospel, used Mark as an outline. In fact, out of Mark's 661 verses, Matthew uses 600 of them. Not word for word, he makes subtle changes in those, but it was obvious from that when Matthew's gospel was written, Mark was a very important source for that author. Also, there is a part of Matthew that it shares in common with Luke called the Q source. This is different. These are sources not found in Mark, but they're found in Matthew and Luke. And then Matthew also has a section of writing that is unique just to Matthew's gospel itself. Now, the way the gospel is structured is there's a prologue and the infancy narratives, which are chapter 1 and 2. But the rest of the gospel, except for the end, where there's a passion narrative and the story on the resurrection, in between that prologue and the end of the gospel with the passion, there are 5 books, what we call books. Each book is divided into a narrative and a discourse. And as we go through this class, we'll look at each of those books. The first one is on discipleship. What does it take to be a disciple? The second one is on apostleship. What does it take to be an apostle? The middle book is on the hidden revelations that are available. The 4th section is on the church, and the 5th section is on judgment. Now, some biblical scholars believe that Matthew's gospel was used as a handbook for the church. If you want to know how to be a good disciple, you read the narrative and discourse in book 1. If you wanted to know how the church ought to function, you went to book 4 and you read the narrative and discourse in book 4. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to pause this video and read chapters 1 and 2 of the Gospel according to Matthew. And after you finish reading those, then turn this video back on and we'll take a look specifically at what those chapters represent. So turn it off and we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, we're back. Now, let's take a look at those first 2 chapters, the prologue and infancy story of Matthew's Gospel. what he's trying to do is he's trying to tell us who this Christ is. It's, you might say, the book of Genesis for Jesus. Now, the book starts right off with a genealogy. And I hope you read all of those names. And hope you were glad you didn't have to say those names out loud. As you go through and you look at that genealogy, the first thing you notice that Abraham, the father of Isaac, is the first person mentioned in that genealogy. Now, this genealogy here in Matthew follows Joseph, Jesus' adopted father, if you will. And in Luke, we find the same kind of genealogy, although it gives us Mary's genealogy. And in Luke's gospel, he starts with Adam, all mankind. But here, because this book is written for the Jews, this story starts with Abraham, the father of the Jewish heritage. That's the lineage that's important. And it's also important to remember that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac until God intervened and gave him the animal to be sacrificed. So as Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, maybe Matthew was telling us that God was also willing to sacrifice his son. The only difference was nobody provided a substitute. Now, this genealogy is divided into sections. The way it's laid out, there are 14 generations from Abraham to David. There are 14 generations from David to the deportation in Babylon, and then 14 generations from Babylon to the birth of Christ. 14 and 14 and 14, as it says in verse 17 of the first chapter. Now, within that first segment of names, notice that there are 4 women who are referenced. The first is right there in verse 3, Tamar. Tamar was a harlot, and yet she's included in this. Rahab was a harlot, a Gentile harlot, and she's included. Ruth, you know her from the Old Testament story. She was a Gentile of Moab, from Moab. So you have these 3 women, and then down in, when we get to verse 6, we have the mention of David as the son of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And remember, David had Solomon through an adulterous relationship with this woman. He had her husband killed so he could marry her. In the other genealogy in Luke, this is completely told differently, because we're not following the lineage from Joseph, we're following Mary's lineage. But in this one, here we have the story where we have this woman who gave birth to David, or gave birth to Solomon, and they follow then the genealogy through Solomon. In Luke, it's the son of David, Nathan, who came from a legitimate source. So anyway, here we have this infancy narrative, which is presupposing the Christology of the church, that they're telling this story to people who probably knew this story, but they're embellishing it a little bit, and they're trying to show that God is a mighty, that Christ is a mighty act from God. So it also tells those early Christians how to find Jesus. Here we have the story when Jesus was born. There were wise men who came from the east. These were men who wanted to search and find Jesus. Now, they went to the Jews to ask where Jesus was. They knew where to find him, but they weren't searching for him. Herod, on the other hand, searched for him but couldn't find him, which begs the question for us: do we search and find, or do we not search Or do we search and not find? Are we looking in the wrong places? The Lord is the Lord of persecuted people who was persecuted himself. And the infancy narrative is symbolic of the persecution of the Lord in the world. Even as a babe, he was persecuted. They were trying to kill him. They were trying to find him, and they were trying to kill him. Now, this whole story of Herod trying to find the child and to put him to death, and in his frustration killed all the firstborn, harkens back to the story of Moses. When Moses was placed in the bulrushes, the reason the Pharaoh's daughter put him there was to save his life, because the Pharaoh in a dream knew that there was going to be some young person born who was going to lead a rebellion or revolt against his kingdom. So to save him, this woman placed him in a boat and put him in the river so that he would survive. And just as this all occurred to Moses while he was down in Egypt, where did Jesus' parents take him? They will pack up and they head for Egypt. So this whole story that we have, and this is completely different than the story that we have in Luke's gospel. This is a story that harkens to the Jewish heritage. And these people wanted to talk about what was important to Jews and how is that now important to Christians. And I think when you read this, what you need to look at is, how does the infancy narrative of Jesus reflect our relationship with Christ? You know, when we discover him, do we discover him as a child? Do we seek him? Do we find him? And when we realize who he is, do we accept him as the true Messiah, the King of Kings, or do we say he's just another guy and it's a sweet story? Now, I'd like you to reread chapters 1 and 2 and pay careful attention and see if you can find these similarities between what happens with Jesus at his birth and in infancy and what happens later on. Now let me make one other comment. We have these wise men who bring them gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We have no idea how many wise men there were. We assume, or some people have assumed, that because they brought him gold and frankincense and myrrh, that they were 3 different men carrying these 3 different gifts. However, there could have been more than 3 people, and they could have all been carrying gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And just because we have a hymn, We Three Kings, it lists the names for the solos for those 3 verses in the middle of that hymn, doesn't mean there really were just 3. This is, remember, a story that the author of Matthew is telling to try to make some relevance out of what happened. We have wise men in Matthew's gospel, we have shepherds in Luke's gospel, and they write for their audience, and they each tell a different story. That concludes this part of the lesson. Next week, when we get together, we'll look at the first book on discipleship. And we'll look at chapters 3 through 7, the narrative being chapters 3 through 4, and the discourse 5 through 7, which is comprised mostly of the Sermon on the Mount. Until then, have a good week. Take care.